Win number 50 did not come easy for Max Verstappen. Started P6. He had a brake problem for most of the Grand Prix distance in the Red Bull RB19, but he nursed that. He scythed his way through the field. He lost a bit of time behind the Ferraris, but he was up to P3 by the time the first pit stop windows opened. And interestingly, he was the first to stop. This was partly because already he'd had the first signs of this brake problem and he's going to need as much grip as he could possibly have. And secondly, because of course he'd used up the tyres quite a lot in traffic, particularly behind the Ferraris. So at this point, it was Lando Norris leading the race, looking like a guy who's been leading Formula One races from the start throughout his career. Beautiful driving by Lando in that early phase of the race. Lewis Hamilton lost a bit of time behind the Ferraris as well, behind Charles Leclerc specifically. But once he got up to second place, he looked very, very strong too. So we had two Mercedes-powered cars, the factory car in P2, Lando Norris in P1, and then P3, but with the tyres already starting to go, Max Verstappen in the Red Bull. And as I say, he was nursing this brake problem. What was that brake problem? Well, we don't know the precise details, but it looked from what we could see that he was having to extend his braking distance because he wasn't absolutely sure how much brake retardation he was going to get down into what is the exclusive, unique Max Verstappen rotation point. And that meant that he was having to adjust his driving style, just as he has done at various stages of this year, according to the way the Pirelli tyres have been developed. On this occasion, it was to do with the brake problem that he was nursing, probably overheating. We saw Aston Martin with brake problems from the start of the weekend. Looks as if the Sergio Perez car had no brake issues, so it seemed to be specific to Max's car. But there was nothing he could do other than extend the braking area a little bit and obviously lose time there, and to adjust his driving style, as I say. And that came into focus in Sector 3, where there are lots of stop-starts, where it was really important to make sure that he had no lockups, did not run wide. And on this section, just watching Max over a period of 10, 15, 20 laps, it was pretty clear that he was not braking as hard. He was looking for a higher minimum speed that he normally has. He was getting on the power a little bit sooner, which meant turning in a little bit later and driving a little bit, dare I say, like Lando Norris or Carlos Sainz. And that's what he did. And he kept it on the island. He had very, very few moments in terms of lockups, in terms of really looking as if he had a brake problem from the outside. Through Sector 1, he maximised the car's change of direction, high-speed change of direction. He was always good through there. And Sector 2, yes, he had the main straight that he could always count on there as something that could elevate the Red Bull if he did have a problem breaking into the hairpin. And Lewis Hamilton it was in the Mercedes that had more confidence as the race unfolded in the grip and the agility of the car in which he was sitting. That Mercedes looked really good on all parts of the circuit. And because of the large DRS effect, because they're running big rear wings here, and because it's a long straight anyway, the main straight, obviously forget about the pit straight with DRS, although it did help a few runners into overtaking moves into turn 1. But in terms of the back straight, Lewis was not really at a disadvantage at any point of the race. He looked strong, particularly against the Ferraris early on. Very embarrassing for the Ferraris to see how Lewis was able to catch them and pass them in that opening stint. Anyway, going back to the front of the race, and I've got to phrase it like that because the Ferraris were never really in it from the moment the lights went out. Lando Norris, at his second stop, had to go to the hard tyre as well. There were already signs of serious degradation on the McLaren, and that really meant that his challenge in terms of the lead was fading away, because with Lewis going to the medium tyre for his second stop, then Mercedes obviously were confident they could take that car through to the finish. Max, of course, by this point, having run 2 sets of mediums, had to run the hard tyre, and he had the brake problem. So there was a lot of urging going on the radio with Lewis Hamilton, but he was P3. He was sort of 7 seconds behind the leader, Max Verstappen. But he very quickly caught Lando in that closing stint, and he was right on Max as the checkered flag came out. I think the final element of that defining stint was Lando having to run the hard tyre again, whereas Lewis would go to the medium. And I think that's because, and it goes back to this business of the Pirelli compound, the hardest in the Pirelli compound range suit the McLaren very well. Whenever it's been that tyre for the Grand Prix weekend, McLaren have always gone well. And that's an indication that McLaren do have a lot of very efficient, well, let's say a lot of downforce. The problem for McLaren, when they go to faster circuits with long straights, a little bit like Austin, certainly like Monza, has been how to keep that grip level, but be quick on the straight as well, because downforce to some extent does equal drag. And McLaren did that quite well in Austin, as I said yesterday. They were pretty quick on the straight, and over the lap on a new set of tyres, they were very good. New set of medium or soft tyres, they were very good. But in terms of race conditions, when it was really hot, it looks as if that the wing they had to take out of the car meant that they were taking too much, asking too much from the tyres, from the car, on the slower parts of the lap, on the corners, in the braking areas. And therefore their degradation was higher. Whereas Mercedes didn't really ever have that option. They were never really going to be very good on the straight. So they just focused on having a very, very good car around the lap in terms of balance, grip, and drivability. And that's what they had. And that's why they're able to run that medium tyre at the end, I think. Whereas McLaren, I think that's where they were exposed in the way they had to take some downforce out of the car and the detrimental effect that had on the tyres. Lando said afterwards, I think it would have been a cooler day, we would have been better off. And that's an indication that they were asking too much from the tread of the tyre and it was moving too much. And had it been a cooler day, perhaps they wouldn't have had so much tyre trouble, thermal trouble. So here around Austin, the Mercedes was a better car than the McLaren. Here around Austin, even though it had a brake problem, the Red Bull was better than both of them. As you said yesterday, if you look at the average in terms of all three sectors, Red Bull had it sewn up almost from the start. All it needed was Max to make no mistakes. And that didn't happen. Even Lewis was complimentary about, I say even Lewis, because he doesn't often say great things about Max. He says a lot of great things about the team, but not a lot about Max. But he was very complimentary about Max after this race, the way he didn't make any mistakes with that brake problem. And I think Max kept it pretty simple. It wasn't that he just had to try and find a weird way of using the brake pedal or coming out of the brakes a different way. As I say, what he did was just focus on not braking particularly hard into a rotation point, but braking hard in a straight line, keeping everything very calm, and then getting on the power as soon as possible. And that was, and he can do that. He can do that as well as anybody. He can do the other bit better than everybody, apart from probably Lewis right now. Immediately, I think Charles Leclerc, because I always put Charles up there with Max and Lewis. Charles had a terrible race, but not really his fault. A very bad start from the pole, which you wouldn't have expected for. I would have put a lot of money on Charles leading out of turn one in Austin from the pole. He always makes a good start. Ferraris make good starts. He's on the pole, and yet he didn't. And it was Lando Norris that got it. And then, unbelievably, Ferrari put him on a one-stop strategy. There was sort of quite unctuous radio stuff about, just for information, Charles, George Russell is doing this lap time and Sergio Perez is doing that lap time. And I can imagine inside the cockpit, Leclerc was thinking, what are these guys talking about? I'm on the pole and this race is slipping through our fingers and I'm on a one-stop strategy. What is going on? Started them on the medium, put him on the hard, and by the time it was very, very clear that they'd made a massive mistake and they should have just run a normal two-stop like Carlos Sainz in the other car, they said, we're not sure this is working particularly well, Charles. What do you think we should do? Should we go to the other strategy? And Charles quite correctly got on the radio to say, well, it's a bit late to be saying that. We completely blown it anyway. It doesn't really matter what we do now. So he stayed out there, droned around. And to his credit, still beat George Russell on the road. Amazing, actually, that he did that. And that says a lot about Charles Leclerc, I think. But very irritated, of course, to have to cede position towards the end of the race to Carlos Sainz. Carlos, obviously, much quicker at that point. He's on a set of mediums, and Charles droning around on these hard tyres. But even then, he said, but why do I have to do this? Let's talk about it after the race. And his point, quite clearly, would have been, well, this is not my fault that I'm on this ridiculous strategy. And if you're going to put me on this strategy, you can't then expect me then also to give position to Carlos. And referred to him as Sainz as well, which is quite interesting, I think. Anyway, at least he knows his name. Very, very badly run race for Charles Leclerc, I thought. And from the pole as well. I mean, Ferrari shouldn't have been that bad around Austin, as we saw. They were quick enough to be on the pole, as I say. And yet, it's just like, after 3 laps, it was, where are the Ferraris? What are they doing? And Carlos drove very well. Towards the end, there was half a chance he was going to catch Lando Norris. He was struggling on the hard tyres, Carlos on the medium. But he didn't do it. Finished 4th for Ferrari. 5th was, I've got to look down because I can't even remember who was 5th. Oh yeah, Sergio Perez, who basically did nothing all day. And Charles Leclerc, P6. George Russell, 7. Pierre Gasly drove very well, 8th. I mean, he's driven well all weekend. The Alpine deserved to be in the points. Lance Stroll had his best weekend of the year, probably. He's up sort of doing the same lap times as Fernando Alonso and exchanging places with him periodically. I think he incurred Fernando's wrath at one point. in Fernando felt it was being held up or something. But Lance Stroll in the points, which is what he needed, and Yuki Tsunoda P10 for AlphaTauri, and came in for soft tyres right at the end and set fastest lap, incredibly. But there you go. He's got that asterisk next to his name forevermore. A word about Lewis Hamilton, because he made the point after the race of saying how low he'd felt after Qatar. Of course, we heard him on the radio at Qatar saying, I can't believe my teammate has done this to me. But quite clearly, it was Lewis's fault, as we said at the time. And as we've been saying since Abu Dhabi 21, really, this has been an incredibly difficult time for Lewis, because he hasn't got a race-winning car. He's often elbows out with the likes of, Yuki Tsunoda or his teammate for sure, for fifth place or whatever it is. And not being Lewis Hamilton, doing what he's been doing most of his life. And yet he's driven incredibly well, by and large. I mean, Qatar was obviously a glitch, but he's driven pretty well, very well, considering that, he's a 7 times champion, doesn't really need to be doing this anyway. And I think, he made the point that Austin was a really big race for him because he was Lewis again, and he did everything he possibly could, and it worked. And throughout the weekend, he's been a strong force, and he looked good. And George has been a bit of a messy second driver this weekend, with lots of track limit penalties and things like that. And Lewis looked like a real class act, and Max Verstappen for sure was concerned in those last couple of laps of the Grand Prix. I mean, it was quite interesting looking at all the sector times as the race wound down. 26.9, 26.9, basically both doing the same sector 1. Then Max would do a 40.1 and Lewis would do a 40.6 or something like that, sector 2, because of the top speed still, and then they'd swap it around when Max would be saving something. But then sector 3, which is the one where the brake issue was really hurting Max, and he was really having to drive around it in a sort of Carlos Sainz-ish style, half a second a lap, basically, Lewis was getting on him through sector 3. And so that, there's nothing worse than a brake problem, really, when you're under pressure, when people are catching you. You're on the hard tyre, he's on the medium, your tyre's got a brake problem, his hasn't, and the laps, there's still 4 or 5 laps to go. That's a lot of pressure when you're coming into a number of heavy braking areas. Nothing worse, really, for a racing driver. Max made no mistakes, and it was because he came into that zone of driving differently, just used his head and was very calm about it. And had he continued to drive the way Max normally drives, I'd be willing to bet that he would have had some sort of big understeer moment, might have run wide, might have had a big lock up, because rotating the car while you're actually braking is a really difficult thing to do. Even when the brakes are perfect, you don't even want to go near it when you've got a brake problem. And so he solved that problem beautifully. And interestingly, he was getting very irate on the radio. I felt a bit sorry for Pierre, his race engineer, because he managed to choose virtually every time he said something to Max, which was usually sort of gaps to Lewis or whatever it was. He chose a braking area when Max was absolutely focused on doing something that he doesn't normally do and trying to get it absolutely right. And then he'd get the radio in there saying, you're 4.5 seconds ahead of Lewis. And he'd say, don't talk to me while I'm braking. He was actually expletive deleted at one point when he was talking about the brakes. Max, you're the triple world champion. You're not allowed to do that. They beeped it, obviously. But, lots of young kids watching Formula One these days. I think there should be some sort of code of conduct to do with language, because even young kids today know what a bleep is, don't they? So we don't need any more of that. Bernie started all that when he allowed Ralf Schumacher to get away with it years ago, when he used the F word for the first time, and that I'd ever heard on the radio. And Bernie thought it was a big laugh and really good for Formula One. And, I totally disagreed at the time for the same reason I disagree with it now. I think, if you've got young kids and you're trying to get to a young audience, you don't allow that sort of thing. It's not allowed in other sports, and it shouldn't be allowed in Formula One. And they do a good job of deleting it. I know that, but one day it'll slip through. Anyway, there we are. US Grand Prix at Austin. A lot of fanfare, a lot of this is Formula One in the United States. Quite not emotional. It's quite moving, I think, the pre-race stuff. And it was a good race for the fans. Packed fans, 30-degree heat. What is that? 90 in American thing in Fahrenheit. And it was a good race. Place changes. The fans voted Lando driver of the day, partly because I think everybody loves Lando. And he did do a good job from the start, led that Grand Prix, sort of Jim Clark style from the front row. And that was good. But from P6 to win the race and nurse a brake problem, that was also Jim Clark stuff. That was Jim Clark stuff circa 65 British Grand Prix, when Jimmy had the oil pressure problem, was having to turn off the engine, I repeat it, through the quick corners to save the bearings, and then clutch start the engine coming out of the quick corners to try and beat Graham Hill to the line with 4 laps to go. And he did, just as Max Verstappen did. So there we are. Really, really good drive. Enjoyed that race. In the meantime, big thanks to Jetcraft and to Pitbox.io for their support of this channel, and to you, the viewer, for watching. We'll be back again very soon, because this is only the first part of a triple header. We'll be back now for the Mexican Grand Prix. Lots of Mexican fans in Austin. There always have been, across the border to Texas. And they'll be looking for a Perez win, won't they? Oh well, and Red Bull will go well there for sure. I can't imagine, as I said in a live stream a while ago, I think if for some reason Max is P2 and Perez is leading with 25 laps to go, I'm not sure he's going to drive quite as hard as he normally would in order to try to beat his teammate. I think at that point we may see a Perez win, but otherwise I think Max will be going into Mexico thinking, yep, here's another one, I want to win, number 51 please. We'll see what happens then. See you on Friday.